Hello, and today we're going to be looking at chapter 24 of Jane Eyre. So you should have already had a look at chapter 23. If you haven't, you need to go and do that first. There is a video, you can find it in the Jane Eyre playlist or you can find it on Classroom. It's important that you have had a look at 23 because, spoilers, that is the chapter with the proposal, so it's really important that you've looked at that. If you don't look at anything else, you need to make sure that you've looked at that before you look at chapter 24. Now, at the beginning of chapter 24, it's the morning after the night before, so it's the morning after the proposal. And the first thing that Jane feels is as though it's almost like a dream. We have this idea of dreams and reality coming throughout the novel. She looks at her reflection. We always know that whenever Jane is looking at her reflection, that's going to be a big moment in Jane Eyre. You'll remember when she was looking at her reflection in the mirror when she was in the red room, when she thought she saw the ghost. But here she feels that she is no longer plain. And she starts to describe how she's actually starting to look a bit more beautiful. She's got hope, she's got life. Her eyes seem as though they've got hope. They've beheld the fountain of fruition, they've got hope. And they've got beams, they're lustrous. She's looking a lot lighter, she's looking a lot happier. She now feels that she isn't going to cool his affection, fire and ice. She isn't going to cool his affection by the way that she looks. She puts a plain dress on, remember plain Jane, but she says that she looks the best she's ever looked. No attire had ever so well become me. And the reason for that is that she is in so blissful a mood. She then says that the morning, so not only is she beautiful, but the weather is beautiful. It's this idea throughout that she is using that pathetic fallacy. So we saw that pathetic fallacy happen before, this idea of her love for Rochester, and it makes everything beautiful. Even though there was a tempest, the storm last night, you'll remember it split the tree in half, and we talked about the symbolism of that in large detail. But now, today, it's fresh, it's fragrant, and this is a lovely quotation, bit of a money quote there. Nature must be gladsome when I was so happy. I cannot think of a more direct example of pathetic fallacy than that sentence. And since it's only 9 words long, you can absolutely learn that quotation and use it. Jane is so happy that she gives away her money. Remember, Jane's quite poor. She gives away her money to some beggars. And generally her heart is merry and musical. Now, you've probably noticed this idea of fresh and fragrant, merry and musical, all this alliteration showing how poetic she feels about it, how happy she feels about it. She's a bit worried by Miss Fairfax's reaction to her. Remember that Miss Fairfax doesn't actually know that Rochester has proposed to Jane. From Miss Fairfax's point of view, she's seen Jane coming in late at night with a man who she's not married to. And remember, it's the Victorian era. She's not allowed to be unaccompanied with any man who isn't her relative or her husband. So this problem is coming through here. This idea that Jane is in some way doing something wrong is coming through here. When Jane meets Adele, she finds out that Mr. Rochester has sent for her. And Jane is happy that she's not in the cold anymore, fire and ice. Instead, she gets an embrace and a kiss from Mr. Rochester. She says it seemed natural and genial, so she feels loved and caressed and looked after, and she's very happy. She does still call Rochester her master, though, so it's this idea that there's still a difference in the class between the two of them. He also notices her newfound beauty, though, blooming and smiling and pretty, truly pretty this morning, and compares it to her before. He calls her a pale little elf. Now, this nomenclature runs throughout the novel, so this idea of calling her an elf shows this idea that she is almost otherworldly and fairy-like, but it's huge in this chapter. And if you were looking for examples of this fairy tale language, this chapter is the best one to go to if you want it from Rochester's side. But he also notices that she's changed in the way that she looks. So he also notices it, and he calls her sunny-faced. So again, it's drawing that comparison between the weather, the pathetic fallacy, and the way that she looks. But he also notices that she's looking lovely. However, he says that she has hazel eyes, and she says that she has green eyes, suggesting that he doesn't truly know her. He's presenting his own view of something else onto her. This little bit about the mustard seed here. Is this my mustard seed? He's not saying she's spicy. He's talking about the parable of the mustard seed from the Bible. So the short version of that story is there's a farmer and he's sowing some mustard seeds, and then they grow and they make awesome plants. So even though the mustard seed is really small and rubbish, the plant it grows into is really strong and mighty. In the Bible, it's being used to represent the growth of a religion from a small start to a big religion later on. But he's using it to talk about Jane, this idea that she's small and plain, like a mustard seed. It's kind of boring, it's just a small brown seed, but it grows into a cool big plant. You have this idea of nomenclature at all. She calls herself Jane Eyre, and he then renames her Jane Rochester, obviously putting his name onto her, takes ownership of her. It shows this idea of the gender relationship. But also, it's just him talking about their marriage. They're going to get married. And he says that he wants to get married in 4 weeks, which is really, really soon. But she kind of goes into it with excitement. She says she feels giddy. She says, though, she feels joy and then almost fear. She's kind of surprised. She should be afraid because this is all very sudden and also a bit odd. Why is he making them get married so quickly? Obviously, we as the reader know he's got a bit of a hurry on because he doesn't want to, leave it too long and then for her to find out there's a mad lady in the attic. But from her perspective, it's like, oh, wow, he loves me so much. And she kind of says, oh, well, you've given me a new name and it's strange. Then he gives her another new name, Mrs. Rochester, and then calls her Fairfax Rochester's girl bride. Obviously quite odd, pointing out the age difference between them in a bit more of an obvious way, because the choice of girl for the bride when she should be a woman, the bride, and also Mrs. Rochester completely takes Jane out of the description. She doesn't have any part of Jane Eyre left in that description. In his view of her being married to him, she becomes entirely his wife. This is one of the reasons that Jane and Rochester cannot get married at this point in the novel. They can get married at the end, because at the end they come together as equals. But at this point in the novel, he can't come to her as an equal. He doesn't understand her to be a person in her own right. And he doesn't understand that his identity can't just take over her identity, which is what he's trying to do here. She kind of says, it's okay, look, we're not going to have happiness. She says this really specific thing: human beings never enjoy happiness in this world. I was not born for a different destiny to the rest of my species. She says basically people can never be happy all of the time, which is true, but not something that you would expect to find in a romantic novel with either a big R or a little r. It's very logical and sensible and very Jane. Jane does speak very logically and very sensibly, but it conflicts with Rochester's over-the-top romantic ideas about her. Because again, Rochester needs to come to a more realistic view of her and a more realistic view of what their relationship can be before their relationship can work. She also then says to imagine it is a fairy tale. This idea of, oh, well, that wasn't what I meant to do. Okay. This idea of fairy tales kind of comes through consistently in this chapter. So it's this idea that she feels that it's unrealistic, an unrealistic expectation. He then says that he can and will realise, he will make the fairy tale real. obviously he can't make a fairy tale real, so it just shows this idea that he's doomed before he starts. He asks for jewels to give to Jane and says that he's going to treat her as he'd treat a peer's daughter. So the idea that he'll treat her as if she were a lady. Well, she's not. And she says, never rain jewels, I don't like to hear them spoken of. Now, this is a lovely money quote if you're looking for one. Jewels for Jane Eyre sounds unnatural and strange. If I were going to learn something from this chapter, that would be the quotation I would learn. Why? It is fantastic, if you want to talk about the idea of identity, that she still sees herself as Jane Eyre. Even though she's only getting the jewels because she's going to become Jane Rochester or Mrs. Rochester, Rochester's view of who she's going to be, the fact remains that she is still Jane Eyre and she still sees herself as Jane Eyre, and at the core she's still going to be the same person. And because of the life that she's led so far and the upbringing that she's had so far and the social status that she is in, she doesn't feel that she should have jewels. Governesses don't normally have jewels. Girls from charity schools don't normally have jewels. She's never had jewels before. And it doesn't seem right to her. It doesn't seem part of her identity. This idea that he constantly wants to give her gifts and she wants to reject them, it shows this tension in the class between the two of them. He heightens that description of the tension. He talks about a diamond chain. I will put the diamond chain round your neck and the circlet on your forehead, which it will become, for nature at least has stamped her patent of nobility on this brow, Jane, and I will clasp the bracelets on these fine wrists and load these fairy-like fingers with rings. Look at the language that's used. The diamond chain around your neck. Now, on the one hand, a diamond chain around your neck is lovely. It's just a description of a necklace, right? But on the other hand, having a chain around your neck is this idea of her being treated almost like a pet or like a captive. She feels like she can't escape. The idea of having the bracelets clasped on her wrists gives this idea that she's being grabbed or held like she can't escape. And the idea of having her fingers loaded with rings, it makes it heavy and makes it difficult for her to get away. And this is the kind of imagery that he puts together to describe how he wants to treat her. And she says, well, no, don't talk about it. I'm a plain Quakerish governess. And he says, no, you're a beauty. You're delicate and aerial, so you're like a fairy. You're beautiful. And she says, no, I'm puny and insignificant. You're dreamy, you're sneering, don't be ironical. So she feels made fun of by the way that he's talking. She calls herself Quakerish, as in the Quakers dress plainly. Even now, even today, people who are part of the Quaker faith, they dress modestly, so they cover their bodies and they wear quite plain clothing. And they don't wear lots of jewellery and lots of kind of adornments. And she's saying, that's how I am. I'm very plain. I'm plain Jane. He doesn't accept her though. He calls her a beauty again and again, but just after the desire of his heart. So she is as he sees him. She is as he sees her. In his eyes, she is this. He doesn't see her for who she truly is, and that's one of the reasons that they can't be together at this point in the novel. And he wants everyone else to see her the same way. I will make the world acknowledge your beauty too, which I really became uneasy because I felt he was either deluding himself or trying to delude me. So this idea of delusion. And he kind of says, look, I'm going to dress you up in all these beautiful, expensive things. And she says, no, if you do that, I shall not be your Jane Eyre any longer. So it's this idea that he, by trying to dress her up in the guise of nobility, in the way that he thinks a rich woman should be dressed, he is making her out to be something that she's not. An ape in a harlequin's jacket, a jay in borrowed plumes. So it's this idea, a jay is a kind of bird, so it's like a bird in the wrong feathers. And an ape in a harlequin's jacket, obviously it's unflattering because it's describing her as like an ape dressed up in a funny jacket. But also it's the idea of an ape, to ape someone is to pretend to be like them. So if you walked around behind someone copying everything they did, you'd be aping them. Here, she's saying that she'd be an ape, so she'd be a mimic, but she'd also be unflattering, she'd be unpleasant. And she says, look, I'm not going to dress like a court lady. I'm not a court lady. I'm a governess. But he doesn't notice what she says. He carries on. He tells her that she needs to pick some dresses and that's it, and he's going to take her away to travel and that's it, and he's going to teach her to value herself by just comparison with others. So he's going to teach her to have a bit more self-confidence, which is lovely but isn't really who she is. He talks to her about the travel that they're going to do together, and he says how when he went through Europe before he was really unhappy and he basically wants to redo it, and that kind of underpins his relationship with Jane. It's this idea that he views her as the way that he's going to redo his relationship with Bertha. Remember we talked about Bertha and Jane as being almost like doppelgangers, almost like two sides of the same coin, and Rochester is treating her in very much that way here. He's treating her as the option to do it again. Remember when he is proposing to her and he says, "It will atone, it will atone." So it's this idea that he feels that he is making up for something by being with Jane. And he calls her a very angel. This idea that she is an angel, she's his comforter, she's there to comfort him. And she has to continually reiterate that she is not an angel. She is a real person. I will be myself. So she is who she is. She is a real person with her own identity. And she says, that's not who I am. You need to be serious. You need to see me for who I am. This idea of identity running underneath it the whole time. And Rochester is blind to that. He doesn't see her for who she is yet. So Jane kind of says, I don't think you're going to love me for a long time. I think that this is too ardent to continue. And he tells her that he's been that way before, but only to women who please him only by their faces. So it's this idea that he feels that he loves her because of her personality rather than her looks. And we see, interestingly, here the idea of the soul made of fire. It's this fire and ice imagery. The idea that she could bend but not break, and the idea that she'd be supple rather than breakable, rather than smashable like ice. Interestingly, he says the word true here, the idea that he would be truthful to her, and here, truth. Obviously, a bit of dramatic irony there because we know that he's not being truthful to her. But it's this idea that he in some way loves her for being fire, but we know that fire ultimately is finite, right? It's short-lived. If you set fire to something, it will burn very brightly for a while and then it will go out because it'll run out of fuel. And that's kind of what Jane is saying about his love for her, is that she recognizes his love is too much fire at this point, and she worries that it will fizzle out over time. We're going to compare his love to St. John's love later on, and you'll see that she basically has two options. At the beginning, she has one love who's too much fire and one love who's too much ice, and Rochester brings himself to the midpoint over the course of the novel. You could argue that the fire of him does burn itself out in the fire at Thornfield. So you have this idea running through. She says to him that she's worried that no one has ever come up to a standard, and how can she live up to his standards? And he says, you please me and you master me. So he feels mastered by her, whereas she is using that language all the time. And then he says, you seem to submit, and I like the sense of pliancy you impart. So it's interesting because on the surface level you'd think, oh, he likes it because she's submissive, because she's pliant, but that's not true. What he likes is that she seems to submit. She gives him a sense of pliancy, but she's not actually pliant and she doesn't actually submit to him. And he says when he's, twirling her around, when he's looking after what he perceives as her, as his subordinate, actually she's the one who has influenced and conquered him. Actually, he sees her as the one with all the power. She then talks about the idea of Hercules and Samson. So you have this idea that both of them were betrayed by their women. And he kind of jokes with her about it, but she kind of says, well, hang on, if you're saying that, that's not how I see the situation. That's not how I understand it. And he says basically that he'll give her whatever she wants, anything that she wants in the whole world. And she says, well, I don't want that. Okay. She says, don't send for jewels, don't crown me, don't make this about gold lace, don't put these trappings of a class that I'm not part of on top of me. She says then, you might as well put a border of gold lace around your plain pocket handkerchief. She's comparing herself to a handkerchief. She's saying, look, I'm very practical and very useful, but I'm plain, I'm not interesting. But he says, oh, I might as well gild refined gold, the idea that you can't make gold any better by adding more gold to it. So he sees it in a very different way. He's like, oh, what you're saying is you're already beautiful enough. He's already twisting it. But he lets it go. He lets it move on. And what she says is that she'd really like her curiosity to be gratified. She'd really like to find out something. He immediately panics, okay? So you have the word disturbed, you have this repetition, what, and this adverb here, hastily. Immediate panic from Rochester. Now we know, because we have read the book, that obviously he's panicking about this, because why wouldn't he panic about this? He has a scary, mad wife locked in the attic. But Jane doesn't know that, so from Jane's point of view, it's completely insane that he won't just tell her what she wants to know. Now, he says to her, curiosity is a dangerous petition. And she says, there's no danger in telling me it. But obviously he worries that there is a danger and that the danger is to him. And possibly to Jane, because then she won't be able to get married to him as well. It's interesting their different perceptions at this point. This idea of truth and secrets kind of working here. The feeling that he does not want to tell her the truth regardless of what happens. So he kind of says, hang on, I don't want to tell you the truth. I'd rather give you half of everything I own than tell you what might be actually a secret. She then calls him king. This is based on like King Xerxes. It's the same guy, and it's this idea that why would she want half his estate? Now what's interesting here is she says then, do you think I am a Jew usurer? So it's this idea that she is saying, is she after his money? Obviously, it's really anti-Semitic. She's comparing herself to Queen Esther from the Book of Esther, but Esther probably didn't exist as this Jewish queen because the way that the Persian kings married, so the king is a Persian king, the way that the Persian kings married meant that they wouldn't have probably married and there wouldn't have been the Jewish queen. But she's twisted this story so that it's actually quite anti-Semitic. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the way that Jewish people are treated in the Victorian era, and particularly in Victorian England, in a little bit more detail later on. But this idea is raising this idea of class as being not perfectly straightforward as an idea in Jane Eyre. It's very easy to see Jane Eyre as she's poor, he's rich, she's good, he's bad, but that's not how it works. We see this same idea that Jane is, remember, she's betwixt and between as the governess. She's still got more power than most people. We see this view of her when we see her teaching in the village school later on, because of the way that she describes the village girls. She still sees herself as in some way above certain other people. She still has quite a lot of pride, and that comes through in some of her language choices, including this one. She really wants this confidence. She really wants the secret, and he says, look, you can have whatever is worth having, but don't desire a useless burden, because how will it help you if you know the truth? Don't long for poison. Don't turn out a downright Eve on my hands. So obviously Eve from the Bible, Adam and Eve, she goes after knowledge that she shouldn't have and causes the downfall of all of mankind. And he's saying, don't cause our downfall by asking for knowledge that you shouldn't have. He calls it poison. If someone is telling you their secret is poison, you probably shouldn't marry them. But she just breezes right past it because she's so in love with him. And she says, you told me you like to be conquered, so I'll keep going on. I'm going to keep pushing it. And she says he looks very upset. He's got thick eyebrows. His face looks like a thunderloft. He looks stormy. And she's just stressed him out so much, and we can see that in the way that he's presented here, but she doesn't see it. Hello, lovely sixth formers. Yeah, so it was at about this point that I had accidentally turned the recording off and hadn't realised. So I talked to myself about Jane Eyre for about 20 more minutes, which was fantastic. Um, so I'm redoing the second bit. So if I seem a bit scatty, it's because I can't remember what I've already said and what I'm saying next. If you do have any questions about anything though, please email me. Seriously. The lower key stages email me all the time. You should do it too. Feel free, you're not bothering me. It's actually great. I really like hearing from you. Among other things, it lets me know you're alright. So anyway, now that I've had some experts fix my technical problems, I'm actually going to get on and teach the end of this chapter. Hopefully. Okay, so this then is Jane talking about nomenclature, and she starts talking about it in a really interesting way, because essentially what she does is kind of highlight the idea that she would, this is quite a nice quotation, I'd rather be a thing than an angel. So she's talking about the names that he calls her, and that's not highlighted. Do you see what I mean about the technical issues? So she feels that she would rather be abused than be spoken to nicely. However, if you think about it in terms of rather be a thing than an angel, think about it in terms of the dichotomy of like the angel of the house and the whore or the woman of ill repute. The idea that you could either be a perfect woman or a fallen woman in the Victorian ideology. And Jane is saying, well, I'd rather be a thing. I'd rather not even be considered as a woman. I'd rather be considered a complete outlier rather than be considered as an angel. Think of this also when we think about how she responds to St. John Rivers. Think about how Jane reacts to that in the idea of a religion that's too strong, a religion that makes you less than you are. This quotation becomes much more sensible in terms of rather be a thing than an angel. But she says also here, I like rudeness a great deal better than flattery. Now you could just read that in a much more human way. If you think about the way that Jane has been treated in her life up until this point, she has only ever really been abused. So actually for her, flattery is very out of the ordinary, and it could be quite upsetting for someone to be nice to her. She asks the question that all the readers are longing to have answered. Why on earth did Rochester make her believe that he wanted to marry Miss Ingram? But then look at Rochester's reaction when he has this little rhetorical question here, is that all? And then says, thank God it is, no worse. So he's been asked about his deep romantic intentions towards her, and he's saying, that's okay, that's not a problem, that's fine, that's not a problem answer. Now, obviously we as the reader know, because we have read the novel, that the reason why is what he really doesn't want to be asked is, gee, Roch, have you got any ladies locked in the attic? But from Jane's point of view, this should be a massive red flag that she's thinking, oh my God, what else is worse than this thing that is the worst thing I can think of to ask? And she even describes it as, notice by the way, he looks down at her, okay, smiles at her, and then strokes her hair. So he's treating her, particularly the idea that it's stroked, he's treating her like he's looking down at her, he's stroking her hair. It's the same type of thing you might do for a very small child or even a dog. And she describes it as if seeing a danger averted. So she recognises that he was frightened that she was going to ask something, but she doesn't think to question what it was he was going to ask. Now, it could be that you think that Jane is just really stupid for the sake of plot, so she doesn't ask because that would ruin the plot. It could be that you think that Jane is very innocent because she's had very little interaction with other people. It could be that you think Jane is intentionally not asking. She's intentionally blinding herself to the situation because she doesn't really want to admit that there might be something wrong, because if she does, that puts in jeopardy her relationship with Rochester. Regardless, she misses a lot of clues. He describes her as a fire spirit, which I'm sure you're sitting at home going, hey, fire and ice. And look at then the language here, because you've got your fire and ice language, glowed, cool. And he links that idea of her fire and her glowing with her mutiny, specifically against fate. So this idea that there's an ordered chain of the order of which things should be in the universe, and Jane refuses to take her part in it. Think about this idea of Victorian society as having this really rigid social structure, and Jane's just like, no, I'm going to do my own thing. I'm my own person. I have my own identity, and I'm going to change it as I will. And he points out to her, although he uses this diminutive version of her name, but he points out to her again that it was her who actually made the offer. But then she pulls him back to the question because he goes off a little bit. And he did it specifically to make her jealous. That's what he tells us. And she says that makes him small, not bigger than her finger, shameful and scandalous disgrace, which, you know, as they go together, shows that it's very wrong. And if she reacts like this to his false courting of Miss Ingram, we're being set up. There's a little bit of foreshadowing in terms of the fact that Rochester is full of shame and scandal and disgrace. So Rochester asks about jealousy, but Jane isn't really interested in telling him off for his jealousy. What Jane is... Oh, has it crashed? It hasn't crashed. Everything's fine. Everything's fine, guys. Okay, so Jane isn't interested in talking about being jealous or not jealous. Jane is interested in talking to him about dishonesty. Obviously, we know that he's being very dishonest. Rochester doesn't really care. Look again at this language here. Hey, look, I wonder if you've recognised this. Maybe it's fire and ice. Who knew? And then Jane describes his mind as designing, which is not really a good thing in the Victorian parlance. Whereas if I said, oh, you have a really designing mind, that might seem really nice. Like I was saying, you were creative. But for a Victorian to say someone is designing is calling them calculated or kind of scheming, designing. And we see that, yeah, he is pretty scheming. Takes a fair amount of scheming to keep a crazy lady in the attic. He is damaged morally, and she knows this already when she says his principles on some points are eccentric. It's a very nice way of saying you got some weird ideas about what's okay and what's not okay. You got some very weird morals there. Well, yeah, because that's not right. Eccentric is this idea of crazy. And he says he was never trained and that they've gone awry for want of attention, they've gone wrong. Now also, this idea of trained and grown awry links it to the idea of like a tree. And we talked before about the splitting of the tree when he proposed to Jane. So this bigger idea of the language drawing him together with that image there. The idea that maybe he is split in two. Remember we said that tree was a really useful piece of imagery? You can twist it around however you like it. So Jane says she can only deal with this marriage. She wants to be happy, but she's worried that someone else might be feeling pain. Foreshadowing of the highest order, because of course Bertha feels pain that she's been put aside. He calls her a good little girl, which is very useful. Look also at the possessive my. It's obviously not great, especially considering their age gap. And it puts in this power dynamic, this idea that he's older than her, that he's got this power over her that she doesn't have for herself. He calls his love pure, though. He says that he has a pure love for her. That's up for conjecture for you. You could either say, yeah, he loves her purely, and his life is what taints it. Or you could argue, you remember before he kept saying, it will atone, it will atone. You could argue that he actually isn't purely in love with her. He's partly, at this point, in love with the idea of how much better a person she could make him. And consistently, he talks about the idea of her healing him, and you've got that again here, a pleasant unction. An unction is like an ointment. So if you burnt yourself, you might put an unction on it. So it's this idea that she's going to heal him in some way, that he doesn't love her for herself. He loves her for what she brings to him or what she gives him. So then it's not really a pure love. But then he tries to make it okay. So he says she can ask something more and he wants to be entreated and to yield, but he doesn't mean ask more questions. He wanted her to ask for gifts, etc., which we're going to see a little bit more of in a moment. She doesn't want that. She just wants Miss Fairfax to be told that everything was fine. Obviously, Miss Fairfax, you can see here, was shocked. Remember, the society in which they're living means that women and men can't be outside in the garden together if they're both unmarried or even one unmarried, alone at night. That's very improper. And so, obviously, Miss Fairfax is very worried about it from Jane's perspective. Rochester will lose nothing in this transaction. Men frequently had mistresses in the Victorian era, men of status. So people like Mr. Rochester, who has this beautiful house, and nobody cared about their mistresses. It was just something that happened. To the point where they built houses at the end of their gardens to keep their mistresses in, and it was seen as very normal. Women, on the other hand, were expected to be entirely faithful, and not just faithful, but chaste. So they were expected to be completely innocent and chaste until marriage. Which obviously, if they're out in the garden, it's a bit more of a problem. So it's going to damage Jane's reputation a lot more than it would damage Rochester's. And Rochester agrees to it, and he's going to take her out to Millcote, and then we're going to see all what happens at Millcote. Now, she talks about her station, the idea that that's her standing in life, literally stat, Latin stand, and the idea that her station is her position in life, where she should stand in her life. But the idea that she'd gone past it or she's taken further than it. Rochester says, no, your station is in my heart. The idea that that's where you belong is in your station. He thinks she belongs in her heart, in his heart. Mr. Rochester tells Mrs. Fairfax everything is fine, and Mrs. Fairfax is very confused and not quite sure what to do. She says that she has a quiet mind, and I think this is one of Jane's slight snarky comments, because she's called Mrs. Fairfax sort of not very intelligent before, and she's hinted at it before. But it's this idea that maybe she's saying she's got a quiet mind, she doesn't have too many thoughts. Notice that Mrs. Fairfax, the way that she's presented, is with spectacles, so she seems quite sort of lovely with her Bible. She's presented as stability, and she's definitely a mother figure towards. Guys, I turned it off again. Okay, so obviously Miss Fairfax is surprised, and why wouldn't she be surprised? But it's this idea that she's so innocent and she's so lovely and motherly, and she says that she feels like she's astonished, but then she wonders if it was a dream. She talks about feeling like her husband, who's been dead for a long time, has been beside her, and I've even heard him call my name Alice. Massive foreshadowing for Jane later on. When Rochester calls to her, is it real? Is it a dream? Is it a ghost? Who knows? It's a Victorian novel. It could be all three. And she cannot believe that Rochester has asked Jane to marry him, because it's so far out of what you would expect. Men of his position are not accustomed to marry their governesses. She talks about him being proud. It doesn't mean proud necessarily like we'd say it, like, oh, I'm really proud of you, but proud in terms of prideful a little bit. Having his money, keeping his money as well, being careful, so like kind of keeping his money carefully. But yeah, he's told Jane that they're going to get married. Mrs. Fairfax, though, is just so confused by this, and she's working as a mother figure for Jane. So she goes, I don't understand what's going on. But she says she really doesn't know what's going to happen. And she says, well, hang on. There's no equality in their position in life. So they're not both gentle people. It's not like he's a gentleman, she's a gentlewoman. She's the governess. Okay? And they don't have equality of fortune because she has nothing except what he's paid her, and he has a huge fortune. There's 20 years difference in their ages, so they're not equal on any footing. And until they become a bit more equal, Jane and Rochester, they can't be together. She even points out he might almost be your father, so it's this idea that actually it's really not an ideal relationship for Jane. Jane, you can just see by all these exclamation marks how upset she is. Oh, okay, don't highlight the exclamation marks then. You carry on, you do what you want, stupid computer. There we go. Okay, you can see by all these exclamation marks that Jane is really upset by this. And she doesn't want to be told, basically, that Rochester isn't as perfect as she sees him. And this, I think, leads into that theory that she's not missing those things because she's stupid. She's missing those clues about what's going on with him because she doesn't want to know. And Mrs. Fairfax is really trying to help her. So Jane describes fire and ice. Jane describes Fairfax as being cold, but we know Fairfax isn't cold. If you think back, I think it was like chapter 10 or something, to the introduction of Mrs. Fairfax, when she's sitting by the fire and she's got the cat at her feet, she is all warmth. So this is Jane feeling worried by someone else's coldness, which I think, instead of showing Mrs. Fairfax as being cold, shows how hot Jane has gone, how fire-end Jane has gone, to the point where she's working all on passion, all on emotion, without her rational mind. And Mrs. Fairfax, she says that she's sorry, she doesn't want to upset Jane, and she points out some really good points. She is young and little acquainted with men. Remember that she is very young still, she's pretty much a teenager still. She went to an all-girls church school for most of her entire life and has had no meetings with men other than like Brocklehurst and Rochester for pretty much the whole time. And she says, look, all is not gold that glitters. Just because it's nice, Aragon, by the way, there, just because it's nice doesn't mean it's right. And she then foreshadows like crazy. In this case, I do fear there will be something found to be different to what either you or I expect. Cannot think of any more foreshadowing than that. She's going, look, something is wrong here. Expect the unexpected. She might not know exactly what's going on, but she knows enough to warn her, to tell her she's protecting her. Jane's self-esteem means that she thinks that she is the monster. Again, I would use this. If you were talking about the idea of Jane and Bertha as doppelgangers, that would be a really useful quotation to use there. And she feels really upset by it. Look at all of these question marks. She's asking these questions entirely rhetorically, kind of asking, well, hang on a second, why? What's not good enough about me? She's definitely putting herself up in the world compared to where she was before. But the language that Fairfax uses, I think, is not great for Jane's ideas. She describes, I think accurately, Jane as a sort of pet of Rochester's. Remember, like, literally 3 pages back when he was looking down at her and stroking her head like a dog. She's a little pet of his. And Fairfax kind of says, look, I wanted to warn you, but I was worried and I didn't want to suggest it because I thought it might upset or offend you. I thought I could just trust you and you'd be okay, and it really stressed me out. I cannot tell you what I suffered. So it just shows that idea that she suffered for thinking it, how much she genuinely loves Jane and cares about what happens to Jane. She's not just an employee in the house, she's not just the governess, she's someone who is genuinely loved. And Rochester says, look, I hope it's okay, you can't be too careful. Try and keep Rochester at defense. This is such a money quote. I'm going to see if I can find a new colour. Watch this not work. Okay. Try and keep Mr. Rochester at a distance. Distrust yourself as well as him. Then, if you've got nothing else, like that whole quotation is great, but if you've got nothing else, gentlemen in his station are not accustomed to marry their governesses. It is so perfect if you have any question about class or relationships or Rochester and Jane together, any of those types of questions, it works great for those. It really shows this idea that this is so out of the norm. And it's a lovely lead-in, because you have to talk about historical context on this paper. It's a lovely lead-in to jam in some Victorian historical context. It's really upsetting Jane. She says she's really irritated, but Adele comes in and asks her if she can go. And she calls her my gloomy monitress. So Jane has had no experience really of being parented properly. And if you actually think about what Miss Fairfax has done, all she's said is be careful, just watch yourself. I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm sure it's fine. I really hope it's fine, but I'm just a bit worried. And this is what makes me think that it's not out of stupidity that Jane doesn't see those clues. It's out of willful ignorance. She intentionally chooses not to see them because she wants to love Rochester so much that she's unwilling to believe anything negative about him. Okay, so basically Jane wants Adele to come with them. I think probably is a little bit of protection against Rochester after that conversation she's just had with Fairfax. It's interesting that she's so eager for her to go. It could just be that she loves Adele. You never know, you can't tell. However, whichever one fits best with your essay, that's the one you're going to write. He doesn't want Adele with them at all. He calls her a brat. It mimics some of that energy that Blanche Ingram was giving off towards Adele. But then look at this language. Look, I've opened this again. This is like the fourth time in a row. Look at this imagery. Look, chill, damp. I wonder if there's some fire and ice imagery going on here. The idea that she feels that it's cold of her or uneasy of her, but actually that's the chill and the damp against the fire of Jane's emotions. So Jane's thinking emotionally, and Fairfax has tried to put logic in, and that's what feels chill and feels damp. But Rochester recognises this as the sunshine, fire and ice. The sunshine has gone out of Jane. And tries to give her whatever she wants. So he tries to let Adele come with them. Okay, so then Adele gets in the carriage. She sits over by Jane after she sat by Rochester. Rochester threatens to send her to school, which Jane doesn't really want. Adele doesn't want it either. She's really worried about going without Jane, without Miss. And Rochester says, yep, I'm going to take her up to the moon. Adele very sensibly says, stop being stupid. If she goes to the moon, she'll be starved. Although, as we all know, there's plenty to eat on the moon. However, after that, Rochester goes into this huge fairy tale where he talks all about the ridiculous things they're going to eat. So he says that they're going to collect manna from. He's going to collect manna from her for her. Manna isn't just something that you get if you play Magic the Gathering. It's also food from heaven. So it's the idea of food that's dropped from heaven. Adele again tries to use logic. She might need a fire, but Rochester says that he's going to be the fire to her ice. He's going to lay her down on the edge of a volcano. And she says, no, it's not going to work. It's going to be really uncomfortable. She's not going to have nice clothes. Her clothes will wear out. And he says, look, I'll make them out of clouds. In general, Rochester keeps talking about fairy tales and not about reality. And the point is that Rochester's idea of love is not reality yet. So Rochester and Jane cannot be together while Rochester is still living in a fairy tale, because it's not a fairy tale, it's real life. I mean, it's not real life, it's a novel, but within the confines of the book, it's real life. And so he can't be with Jane while he's still seeing her as a fairy person. He needs to recognize her as a real life human being. He tells a much bigger story about the fairy tale, and he talks about how he was thinking about bad things that happened, and then suddenly this little thing with a veil of gossamer on its head, well, that'd be Jane in her travelling veil, came up, and she was a fairy. Can you see how he's called her a fairy and an elf, and other supernatural type names? But look, he says that her purpose is to make him happy. But that's not Jane's purpose. That's not what Jane puts her purpose across as. Jane's purpose is Jane's own purpose. She doesn't live to make Rochester happy. And until he recognises her as her own individual person, that's not going to work as a relationship. Again, it's this idea that Rochester feels like he wants to go with her, but he just kind of can't keep up. Then he kind of puts Jane in the position of a fairy again. He describes the pretty gold ring. Well, that's obviously the wedding ring, especially because he talks about the fourth finger of her left hand, which I know you're all currently holding up your hand to have a look at the fourth finger of your left hand. It's the one that a wedding ring would go on, just to make that easier. And that's all he's doing, is kind of hinting at the idea that he's got a sovereign in his pocket. He's going to go out and he's going to buy her a wedding ring. And Adele says, "No, hang on, what's it got to do with Miss? You said it was, what's it got to do with Mademoiselle? You said it was about her, but this is about fairy." And he says, "Look, she is a fairy. She's not a fairy, right? She's made that really clear. She's a real life woman." And Jane kind of goes against this. She says, don't even worry about him. He says stupid stuff. And Adele agrees. She calls him like a wind up, like a tease, and says that she's not going to listen to his fairy tales, and that for the rest there weren't even any fairies, and even if there were, she was sure they would never appear to him, nor ever give him rings or offer to live with him in the moon. Quick bit of translation there, because we're not reading through all the French. My god, it should be in the notes for your text. If it's not, you can use the online version and it will just translate it for you, because I'm not expecting you to have a fluent knowledge of French to do English literature. That would be mental. So at that point, we then get to hear about this whole episode at Millcote, which is almost its own thing by itself. But you know what? We're going to get this chapter done today. We're going to do it. It's a huge chapter, and I'm sorry, and I promise they will not all be this long. So lots to get through in their day at Millcote. Okay. He orders her to choose half a dozen dresses. For those of you who are good at numeracy, you'll realise there's about 6. She didn't want dresses. She manages to get that down to 2 dresses. He picks out an amethyst, like a bright purple one, and a pink one. She says, no, that's awful. She can't do it. She might as well wear gold and silver, and that she's never going to wear those clothes. They're too bright. She's literally lived her entire life wearing, the dresses that they wore at Lowood that were made with the bad cheap needles, and then wearing governesses' dresses, and governesses usually wore black or grey. She's always considered herself plain, and she just doesn't feel that she can dress in that way. That's not her personality. Rochester's trying to dress her up and make her into something that she isn't, make her into a fairy in a way that she isn't. That's not what she is. I want you to compare, though, this purple dress, this pink dress, with the blue dress she chooses for herself at the end of the novel, because that's really interesting, and it suggests that given her own choice, she's able to come out of herself and wear colour in a way that she wouldn't have here. So she, instead of pink and amethyst, she picks, notice she calls it sober black and pearl grey, so a sensible black dress. And he says that she doesn't really like it, but he wants to see her glittering, and he's kind of against her feeling innocent. Then you've got a bunch of quotations that are so useful, but I'm going to switch colours again, because they're that good. So we've got, the more he bought me, the more my cheek burned with a sense of annoyance and degradation, which is a very nice one. It's the idea that she feels shamed. Also, burned. Fire and ice. You've also got feverish here, which kind of goes to that idea of the fire and ice thing going on. You've also got dark and bright. Obviously, this idea of the fire and ice thing going on. And then, with everything that's gone on with her, she hadn't really thought about John Eyre having written to her. Massive hint here of what's going to happen. Big foreshadowing. She thinks it would be a relief if I had ever so small an independency, And obviously when she has her independency, when she's an independent woman financially, that is when she and Rochester can come together, because she has her own choices, she has her own money, and she can come to him on an equal footing. But she hates it. She says here, look, and such a good quotation, I can never bear being dressed like a doll by Mr. Rochester. This idea that she feels like she's not being treated as human. Look at the simile, like a doll. She feels like she's being treated more like an object than a person, and that she's being dressed up and kind of falsified and made into something that she's not. She tells us that she is going to write to her uncle straight away and tell him what's going on. And then she thinks, look, if she could just bring Mr. Rochester some fortune sometimes, she'd think that she could be kept by him. It would be easier if she felt like she was an equal partner. And we get that idea that she'd written to him, and that's great. But, you know, as far as we knew, it was a problem. But then here, Rochester's smile. I thought his smile was such as a sultan might in a blissful and fond moment bestow upon his slave his golden gems had enriched. So it's this idea that she feels like she's a slave. Look at that language, like a slave to Rochester, who is a really well-treated slave because he's being given golden gems, but he's still a slave. And then look at this language. I crushed his hand. She just held it tightly. Which was ever hunting mine vigorously. This is quite a violent interaction, and thrust it back. Red with passionate pressure. So this idea that she's very upset by this. Also fire and ice, right? It's red. Okay. So, whew. Jane kind of asserts herself by saying she'd just wear her lowered dresses. I want to be really clear here though, when it says to the end of the chapter, sadly she doesn't mean until the end of chapter 24, she means the chapter in a church, so she'll wear them. And she says she's going to be married in her, you know, cheap dress that she's wearing, a gingham dress that she's wearing, and says, look, you can turn those into clothes for yourself. But Rochester, interestingly, says, like, he wouldn't change her. Little English girl for a whole seraglio. A seraglio is a lovely way of saying, like a brothel, like a harem. And kind of saying, I wouldn't change her for all of those beautiful women. But she didn't like it. The Eastern illusion bit me again. So once you had the idea that she'd come up with the slaves, and interestingly, he's on this Eastern idea as well when he's talking about like a Grand Turk, but so they've got the same idea, but they're viewing it in very different ways. It's this idea that they could be equal, they're nearly on the same idea, but they're just slightly separated, almost like the two halves of that tree, interestingly. And then she's got this lovely quotation here, the idea that she won't stand him 1 inch in the stead of it, the idea that she isn't going to put out, she isn't going to be that woman for him, but also she is going to be a wife, she's going to be proper, she's going to be Christian. And she says, look, if you want that, that's fine, you go buy yourself some slaves, take yourself away, because I'm not going to be part of that. Instead, she would rather go on a mission abroad. Again, massive foreshadowing. Think about what happens between her and St. John in the mission, which is a huge kind of problem. And she kind of says, look, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to preach liberty to people who are enslaved. She has a massive problem with this idea of slavery, and that includes the women that Rochester would buy, because you could still buy people in this time. It was not a thing. She kind of says, no, she's against that. She's against slavery. She's against people being deprived of their freedom. Obviously, birth is going to be a bit of a problem for Jane. Jane very sensibly responds to the idea that Rochester has a bit of a pattern in his behaviour, and she says, look, I don't want to be worried by this. So if we think about Celine Varens for a second, you gave her diamonds and cashmeres as well. I will not be your Celine Varens. Such a useful quotation. And Jane says, no, she's going to keep her independence. She's going to stay in her job, which is crazy. Married women did not work. In the Victorian era, that wasn't a thing. Particularly not of the aristocracy. So married women who were of the lower classes absolutely worked because they had to. But if you were marrying someone like Mr. Rochester, you would not be expected to work if you were married. That would be seen as very weird. But Jane is like, no, I'm going to earn my own place. I'm going to earn my own money. I'm going to buy my own clothes. I'm completely fine with it. I deserve £30 a year. That is what my wages are. That's what I will get. And it's this idea that she feels that she needs her own version of things. She needs her independence. Rochester doesn't agree. He says that she is impudent and prideful, but he still asks her if she would like to have dinner with him. Jane disagrees with Rochester, so Rochester interestingly compares himself to an ogre or a ghoul because he perhaps feels that he's monstrous in some way. And he calls her job slavery. He calls governessing slavery. But Jane disagrees and sees it as the source of her own independence. Rochester even talks about the idea of figuratively attaching her to a chain, so taking away, he wants to take away that independence that she has. He didn't talk about his watch chain, but it's this idea that he sees her as a possession. He describes her to, he compares her when he describes her to a jewel. He kind of consistently wants her attention. He summoned her, so he's again being quite sort of ordering people about, as he has been in previous chapters. But Jane is kind of ready for him, and she says that she wants him to sing her a song. And he asks that she play the accompaniment to the song. She partly did it, and she says here, for motives of expediency. She did it because she just didn't want to stay in a kind of head-to-head, she says here, like a head-to-head conversation with him. She wants him to be distracted from her. So she has, on some level, taken Fairfax's advice on board, because she's not getting into that close one-to-one head-to-head discussion with him that Fairfax warned her about. Rochester again uses that adjective little to describe her and calls her a little bungler, so she's not very good at playing the piano. He kind of should have known that, because she already said that she wasn't very good and that she could not really play very much. But then he sings her this song. I'm not going to go through every single line of this song. I think you can analyse this song yourselves. So I'm going to just leave it there. But if you have any questions, please let me know. The one thing I want to point out here though is my love has sworn with seal and kiss, with me to live to die. Because that's going to come up in a second. So Rochester is really pleased with his little song. And Jane kind of ruins his little romantic thing for a second here. So you've got this kindled, flashing, fire and ice, guys, fire and ice. And the idea that that's linked with the idea of passion, right? It's his emotion, that's his passionate love for her. And she says she quailed momentarily and then rallied, so she almost gave into it. She was almost romanced by the song. And then she goes, no, hang on a second. She's not going to be part of a soft scene or a demonstration of love. She doesn't want to be dragged in before she's married. So she has, on some level, taken Fairfax's advice. But then she talks about a weapon of defence, and then she says that she wetted her tongue. So if you say you wetted something with an H like that, it doesn't mean made it damp, made it wet. It means you sharpened it. So that's where a whetstone comes from. It's got the H in it as well. A whetstone is what you use to sharpen a knife. You wet a knife on a whetstone. But that doesn't mean W-E-T, just to be really, really clear. And she asks him who he's going to marry, and he's like, hang on a second, obviously you, be sensible. And she says, no. He had talked of his future wife dying with him. What did he mean by such a pagan idea? I had no intention of dying with him. He might depend upon that. So we've got a few bits going on here. The idea of dying with him and a pagan idea makes sense. So it used to be, particularly ancient Egypt is one place where this happened quite a lot. If a man of importance died, his wife would be entombed with him, because what did she have to live for now that he was dead? So it's pagan in that way. Also, Jane's rejecting it because she's very Christian, her own version of Christianity, but Christian nonetheless. Look at this italicized I. Can you see how she's putting forth her own identity there? She is the I of that sentence. And she says that she has no intention of dying with him. So she isn't linking herself to him. She's going, you are 20 years older than me. No, I'm not going to die with you. Thank you very much. And then he says, no, 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 death's not for someone like you, being really romantic. And Jane says, yes, I am going to die one day. Everybody dies one day. And he says, I have as good a right to die as he had. The idea that she doesn't want to be hurried away, but she has the same rights he does. And if she wants to die, she's going to die. So she wants to take life and death on her own terms. And then he calls her apostrophized, which means talked about, but you're not really there, as if you're not there. And he calls her a hard little thing, which was her goal, right? She would rather be a thing than an angel. And being called hard, she's not kind of, notice, melted, fire and ice. She's not been melted, she's not been made romantic just because someone's crooning at her, just because someone's singing to her. And she tells him she's hard, but interestingly, she says that she's flinty. And obviously, flint is hard, but also flint is used to make a fire, so fire and ice. And she says that she's rugged, she's like a stone, she's going to be difficult. And she says that she's going to be difficult so that he knows absolutely what he's getting himself into when he marries her. Very interesting that she gives him time to rescind his offer, but she isn't given all the information to rescind her offer. And he sees it as irrational. She says that she is rational. She has reason, and we see that Jane is pretty reasonable most of the time, except when she's deluding herself on Rochester's foresight. Again, fume and fidget, fume, fire and ice. And she says that, you know, she loves him to bits in her head. She says this, she doesn't say it out loud to him. She loves him to bits, but she's not going to get all sentimental about him because she needs to keep space, distance between them that is conducive to their mutual advantage. On the one level, she's probably taking Fairfax's advice. On the other level, Jane's Christian. Jane's not going to do anything outside of wedlock. That's not going to happen. But she doesn't want to be romanced into it, and she knows that Rochester has done that before, in part because she teaches Adele, who may actually be Rochester's child. We're not clear. So she knows that Rochester is not quite as innocent as she is. And then she describes it as, I slipped out by the side door and got away. Describing it as got away suggests that he's almost a threat that she's escaped. And he's very upset by her when she does this. So Jane then just describes the whole way that she keeps him on cross and crusty. This idea that she keeps him on all the time, just at a distance, so she's just slightly difficult for him. She talks about how she thwarted him, afflicted him. She talks about how instead of being described in, and we were talking about nomenclature before, instead of being described in honeyed terms such as love and darling, darling means dear one, instead of that she's described as a provoking puppet, malicious elf, sprite and changeling. Now, we do need to be careful with these though, because puppet less so, but a little bit, but elf, sprite, changeling, all fairy tale creatures. So he still hasn't let go of this fairy tale idea of her. She's less of a fairy queen now and more of a sprite or a changeling, but she's still part of his fairy tale idea of what's going to happen here. And Rochester consistently kind of says that she's driving him mental and he doesn't know how he's going to cope with her. But then this last paragraph here is really interesting to us. She says she would rather have pleased him than teased him. That rhyme just showing the link between the two, that she's teasing him and being difficult because she wishes that she could just please him and just do what he wants. She describes him, oh, there we go. She describes him as her whole world. Interestingly, she has future husband here. Now, we could just read that as oh, because they're engaged to be married, and what if they don't get married? But also, I feel like it gives us the foreshadowing that she will eventually get together with him. But look at this kind of alliteration: whole world, hope of heaven. This idea that it's kind of perfectly matched together in the way the language goes together as well. But he is between her and God. He stood between me and every thought of religion, as an eclipse intervenes between man and the broad sun. I could not in those days see God for his creature, of whom I had made an idol. So she's put Rochester before her religious beliefs to an extent, and she feels that she's betraying herself through that. I think it's interesting that it has "in those days" because it suggests reflectiveness on the part of Jane, and I feel like that's the kind of quotation that a lot of students would miss. But it shows that she's reflecting. Remember that she's writing this after she's been married to Rochester for 10 years. So the whole of the novel has happened, and then 10 years have happened, and then she's writing about it. She's much older. It would be like me writing a novel about when I was your age. It's a real big gap in age, and she is very different later on. So that suggests to us that she maybe changes her relationship with religion later on, as well as her relationship with Rochester. Can I just say how proud I am of you for getting to the end of this chapter? My goodness, this chapter is long. Do not worry, the